University of British Columbia, so he's basically an honorary Canadian. He did a postdoc at the Cascadia Research Collective and is now just starting today as an assistant professor at Stanford. Much of Jeremy's work focuses on baleen whale diving behavior and feeding mechanics, although he's more recently gotten involved in work looking at baleen whale diving behavior relative to military sonar, the effects of military sonar. And today, he's going to talk to us about the biomechanics of filter feeding in Rorqual whales. So, yeah.
Sound good? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Lesley, for that intro. And thanks for the invitation to speak with you today. I was actually born in upstate New York, and haven't been back since I was a little kid. So it's good to be back out east for sure. So, yeah, so today I'm talking about filter feeding on just an amazing scale in terms of body size. I think a lot of us are familiar on a very basic level of what these animals do. They open their mouth, water comes in, prey is suspended in that water, and then they filter out the water to consume the prey. And what I think is less recognized or less appreciated is that these whales form a most unlikely functional group with a lot of other very important marine animals. And I just have a few displayed here. Here's a basking shark. Here is a Broudy's whale, tadpole, and flamingo. So all these animals are filter feeders. And I think it's one of the most remarkable adaptations among aquatic vertebrates. And they comprise a wide diversity of species. They are evolutionarily, ecologically, and economically important. So I think it's important to understand these animals, but they're very poorly understood. And so when you start to look deeper into the different types of filter feeders, you basically have two different types. You have ram filter feeders and suction. Suction is very intuitive. They create negative pressure, and that pulls water into the mouth. Ram feeding is where these animals use their locomotion in order to drive water into the mouth. Everything okay? And so, regardless of the different type of filter feeding mechanism, these animals can take on very large individual size or huge biomass, like large stocks of individuals. And so the basic hypothesis is that these animals have very high energetic efficiency because of this filter feeding mechanism. It's very poorly understood, not only from a biomechanics perspective, but also an energetics perspective. And so what's really interesting about ram feeding, as opposed to suction feeding, is that ram feeding and huge body size has evolved independently many, many times in the course of animal history. And so just showing you a few of the major lineages here. Since the KT boundary, you have huge manta rays, huge whale sharks, basking sharks. That's megamouth, something that, a really cool animal we know nothing about. And then, of course, the bulk filter feeding mammals, the whales. And so, and I forgot to mention, also teleost fish. There was a 100 million year dynasty of giant ram feeding teleost fish. So a really interesting group. We don't know much about ram feeding. And so if you're a really big ram feeder or a small ram feeder, that presents a unique physical challenge because we know for a long time that most good swimming and flying animals are well streamlined, and that's to reduce drag and increase the efficiency of locomotion. But of course, ram feeders, they're swimming with their mouth wide open. And that presents a high proportion of the mouth to flow that will increase drag. So that's sort of a paradox. We have well-streamlined body shapes for efficiency, yet at the same time, they are obligate ram feeders, so they will experience drag. And so this paradox is what I've studied over the past 10 years at the very largest scale, the ram feeding whales. And so if you look at baleen whales, there's different types of filter feeding modes that are exhibited by different families. And so these are the belaned whales, the boat-headed right whales. These are basically, I like to describe these as the Hoover vacuums of the ocean. They're big, stocky animals. It's just, look at how big that is. And then this is the mouth aperture. And so here's the tongue right here. And then you have these long racks of baleen that sort of wrap around that tongue. And so these animals cruise at very slow, steady speeds. Water comes into the mouth, it hits the tongue, diverts to either side where it meets the baleen, and that's where the filtration occurs. Just to give you an idea, here's a little video of a filter feeding Humpback whale. And you can see the tongue is actually quite mobile, which is interesting because this big honking tongue right there. And so it's a pretty interesting mechanism. You can tell the speed is very mellow. So that's why I like to think of them as kind of the slow vacuums of the ocean. So in contrast, gray whales, it's only a monotypic family, so just one species. You can tell the tongue is quite a bit smaller there, but it's much more mobile, and they can depress that tongue in order to generate suction. And they're very well known for suction feeding on the benthos, for example. And so the Rorqual whale is what I'm going to talk about today, mostly. And these animals have huge jaws, huge capacious ventral pouches, and then they open up those jaws to wide gape angles, and that allows for increased capacitance of the mouth. And so just to give you a few more shots of how this lunge feeding process occurs, there's a blue whale lunge feeding on its side at the sea surface. Jaws go up into huge gape angles, and again, huge amounts of water go into the mouth. And here's a humpback whale, much more maneuverable species, but you can see the same general process of mouth opening and mouth closure. And here at the smallest scale, the smallest lunge feeding whale, the minke whale, you can see how lunge feeding is at a very different temporal and spatial scale, where the gulps are very smaller. And I'll get into it a little bit later, but the size of the pouch is much smaller relative to the body compared to the larger animals. And so what's interesting about these Rorqual whales, so Rorquals are a family called Balanopteridae. I like to joke around with my colleagues that these are mammals from space, and it's not too far off because they have a lot of adaptations that are really bizarre and unlike any other mammal or unlike any other whale. And this is one of my favorite shots. It's a head-on shot of a Rudy's whale lunge feeding on a school of fish here. Here's this is basically the hard palate right here. These are baleen plates. There's the left side of the baleen plate, or rack rather, the right side of the baleen rack. This is the oropharynx. This is basically where the tongue used to be. I'll get into the tongue a little bit later, but basically the tongue is inverted and shooted back down into the belly button. Here's the left jaw, here's the right jaw, and there's the chin. And this is that pleated ventral pouch. That's one of the most interesting structures among aquatic vertebrates. And so to get into how this mechanism actually works, this was some really good work done by Richard Lamson back in the 1980s. This is basically looking down the mouth of a minke whale. And you can see the outline of basically a traditional mammalian tongue there. It's got that same furrowed structure. But when you put water into that mouth, that tongue basically inverts, and it becomes this capacious sac that holds the engulfed water. And so for an animal that just took a gulp like this, you could see how the tongue would actually go all the way back to the belly button. So it's pretty extraordinary that these are mammals. And in most mammals, the tongue is very well muscularized. And these guys, it's almost like a water bed, and it's able to deform and become this huge pouch. And it basically allows them to have this huge capacitance. And of course, once the jaws close around that engulfed water, they can depress that buccal cavity using muscles inside the pouch. Since the water past the baleen plates allows the animal to swallow the engulfed prey. So I mentioned those ventral pleats before. I call it the ventral groove blubber, and it goes all the way from the snout all the way back to the belly button. So on something like this 20-meter fin whale, that's actually 10 meters long. And you can just see the sense of scale here relative to these whalers and the flensors. So if you look at the structure in cross-section, say right there, it's pretty amazing. It looks almost accordion-like, as if it could extend reversibly under pressure. And so you see fat here, huge chunks of elastin, and then muscle. This is basic epithelium. So what's interesting about the ventral groove blubber is it has this really extraordinary mechanical behavior. If you were to take blubber at any other part of the animal and try to stretch it, it would be very inextensible. But when you take the ventral groove blubber and you extend it, it's reversibly extensible up to 400%. And so it's pretty amazing. And there's actually muscle in there too. Imagine taking your calf muscle and stretching it 400%. You would break the cross bridges and wouldn't be functional. I could talk more about that later. I don't have time to talk about that now, but there's actually microstructure that's crimped, so it allows those muscles to unfold before they can be operational. And no other mammal has that, to my knowledge. And so this is a nice kind of slow motion video. You can see how those pleats expand as water is going into the mouth. Must be pretty cool to be this person. So in addition to having a deformable tongue that can invert, the ventral groove blubber, they also have specialized jaw joints that are unique to most mammals. And you probably noticed in those videos that extreme gait. And so they have a specialized jaw joint here. And so in most mammals, we have what's called a synovial jaw joint. And so in a synovial jaw joint, you have the jawbone here at the base of the skull. It's a very tight articulation. And so that allows for smooth, low friction movement, but very limited movement. And these guys, they've totally lost the synovial joint. And instead, they have this huge block of fibrocartilage that's filled with oil, basically, and allows those jaws to be hugely extensible. And so not only do they have that here at the temporomandibular joint, but they also have a third jaw joint, and that's at the chin or the mandibular symphysis here, where the tips of the two jaws meet. And allows those two jaw mandibles to be kinetic with respect to one another. So that, and you can see that right here in this picture here, in this dead whale, where you can see the jaws are sort of basically flopped open. And so having that maneuverability in the jaws is really important for how these animals feed, because it increases the area of the mouth, and then therefore it allows them to have more water and prey go into the mouth. And this is a humpback whale basically lunging straight up out of the ocean. You can see the left flipper here, right flipper here. Here's the top of the skull. There's the left jaw, and there's the right jaw. Notice how curved those jaws are. That's also a feature that increases the area of the mouth. And then here's a moment later when those jaws are starting to rotate back in. Look at that dramatic decrease in area. So you can see how that's a real feature and a real advantage for these ram-feeding whales. And so that's kind of a quick snapshot of the extraordinary biomechanical adaptations of these animals. But what I wanted to do in my thesis was to actually get some kinematic data of these whales exhibiting this behavior in the wild. And so lately we've had a class of multi-sensor tags that have allowed us to do that on very short timescales, on the timescales of hours to days. And so these they don't quite evolve as fast as the iPhone, but every few years we get tags that are smaller and have greater capacities for sample rates and so on. So we have a time depth recorder in these, basically looking at the dive profiles of these animals. A hydrophone, which we use to get speed, and also accelerometers and magnetometers that we use to measure fine-scale animal movement and orientation. If any of you have a smartphone, whenever you take your phone and you flip it 90 degrees and the screen moves with you, that's an accelerometer and a magnetometer telling you the orientation of the phone relative to the Earth. And that's the same basic principle that we use to measure whale orientation. And so we basically equip the tag with flotation, put it on a pole. Here's my colleague Ari Friedlander tagging a blue whale in flip-flops. And so basically when the timing is right, we deploy the tag onto the whale with the suction cups, and they actually stick very well. Thumbs up. So that's the successful 10 seconds after hours of looking for whales. And so once the tags are deployed, we're able to get our data. Once the tag falls off the whale, it floats back to the surface, we can track it, we can download the data. And so over the past 10 to 15 years, we've been deploying tags up and down the California coast, as far north as Point Reyes, as far south as San Diego. We've been lucky enough to tag a good number of bluefin and humpback whales in different areas. So here's an example of some data from a blue whale, and this is just the depth profile. So on the y-axis here, we've got depth. These are 3 foraging dives going down to about 250 meters, 45 minutes of data. So what's interesting are...
How do you recover the data?
Sorry?
How do you recover the data?
I just mentioned that once the tag falls off the whale, floats back to the surface, we can track the tag. We retrieve the tag, download via USB.
And how long does it stay on?
We have programmable release, so provided that we get a good stick on the animal, we have a burn wire that releases the suction within the suction cup, falls off, comes back up. So here are 3 foraging dives for a blue whale. What's interesting about foraging dives, at least for the very big blue whales, are that you get these kind of vertical undulations in the dive profile. And so when we first saw these, I was very curious as to what those were. And just to zoom in and superimpose this dive profile on a prey field, so basically using active hydroacoustics to get an idea of the ecological context or where prey are relative to the whale. You can see that these vertical undulations are directed at these very dense krill patches. And so adding more information from what we get on the tag, so very fine scale kinematics, you can see how this is the accelerometer trace. So every peak here represents an upstroke and a downstroke of the tail. So you can see when the animal is actively swimming versus actively gliding, which is what you see here. And so you basically have a bout of active fluking, an increase in speed, and then a very dramatic decrease in speed. And so from this kinematic data, it looks like these animals are performing these lunges at the bottom of these deep foraging dives that are directed at very dense patches of krill. So what's really interesting once you get a very fine look at the kinematics is that during this decrease in speed, you also see that the animal is still swimming. So that's interesting, the animal's still swimming, yet it's decreasing very, very rapidly. And so what we basically clued into is that the drag is increasing because the mouth is open. There's a huge amount of mouth area exposed to flow. By definition, that will increase drag. And so that kind of begged the question, well, how much drag is involved? And also, at the same time, how much water is actually going into the mouth? So in order to tackle that question, we basically built a very simple mechanical model based on the mouth area. And so for a given area of the mouth and a distance, and we know distance because we're measuring speed on the tag. So an area over a distance defines the volume. You can basically integrate that over the pouch and over the basically time course of mouth opening and mouth closure. So how do we get mouth area? So as a grad student, I went to basically every museum I could get to and measured the jaw, skull, and the jaw bones and also the skulls of basically any rorqual I could find. So we got on, and this is at the LA County Museum. It's not very safe ladder, but we did it for the sake of science. So we took pictures here, so standardized pictures so we could get basically morphometrics. And so, very simple stuff, you're just measuring skull width, jaw length, and you can integrate mouth area. So when you combine that with the tag data, you basically get a picture of how the water is rushing into the mouth. And so this is just the time course. And so a lunge for an adult fin whale, for example, it's about 20 meters long. It takes about 6 seconds, about 3 seconds to open the mouth, 3 seconds to close. Here's the filling rate. So how many cubic meters per second are going into the pouch? So at maximum gait here, about halfway through the lunge cycle, 20 cubic meters per second are going into the mouth. So it's a pretty extraordinary process in terms of the scale and the magnitude of the water that's going into the mouth. And so just to give you an idea, the mouth area for a fin whale is probably half the area of this wall here. So imagine that coming at you at about 3 meters per second. You can start to see how the volume starts to accumulate into the pouch very rapidly. And in addition to that, the jaws are opening and closing, so it's actually very dynamic. So the process is much more complicated than I'm showing here. And so if you sum this up for an adult fin whale, the engulfed volume, our estimates are 70 cubic meters. But if you think about that relative to the size of the whale, it looks like they're engulfing a volume of water that's larger than their own body size. But when you think about those biomechanical adaptations of the pouch and the tongue, you can see how this is actually physically possible. And so just to kind of recap just some of the tag data and integrating that with the morphological data, these animals are diving to depth. Once they detect a krill patch, they lunge up into that krill patch. And then in between lunges, they're actually spending time to filter. And then they'll perform that lunge again. This is very stereotypical. We've measured this in blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales, and minke whales so far. And so what's interesting is we know when those lunges occur at the bottom of these foraging dives. And we have a pretty good estimate of the engulfment capacity. So if you know the filter time, you can actually calculate a filter rate, and so it's about 2.5 tons per second. So pretty extraordinary filtration capacity. We think that these animals might be employing something called cross-flow filtration. It's actually something we use in biomedical filtration systems. Beer and wine industries use this. If you guys are interested in that, let me know and I'll be happy to talk about that later. So in addition to the engulfment capacity, we were interested in the drag. Drag is important because if you do work against drag, that has the units of energy, and then energy over time you can get at the power output. So you can start to work on the energy budgets of these animals. And so what we found is that drag increases by a factor of 5. That's compared to steady swimming. The work against drag increases by a factor of 3. Drag coefficient, which I'll talk about a little bit later, increases by an order of magnitude, and power output is 40 times basal metabolic rate. So there's actually a pretty huge energetic demand to do this. So why would they do this sort of thing? And so what our next step was to look at the energy budget. I mean, if there's such a huge cost to this lunge feeding method, why would they do it? And we thought that maybe it's because they get so much energy out of it. You can actually make a very simple conservative calculation. If you have an engulfment volume and you have krill density and some reasonable assumptions about assimilation efficiency, you can calculate energy into the animal. And from our drag estimates, we can calculate energy out. So energy in over energy out, energetic efficiency. And so what we've done for blue whales is we made this calculation on very, very conservative densities of krill. We calculated an energetic efficiency of 100. If you compare that to other marine mammals, sea otter of 4, Weddell seal of 10. So you can see how the energetic efficiency is way higher in bulk filter feeding marine mammals. And if you remember at the beginning of the talk, the main hypothesis is that this bulk filter feeding mechanism is energetically efficient. So this seems to be consistent with those hypotheses. And of course, these are particulate filter feeders, so a very different way of going about finding food. And so this is a conservative estimate. Here's the thing, krill patches can be very, very dense. And we made the estimate, if they can find a krill patch that's this dense, their energetic efficiency could actually be much more than 100, it could even be 1,000. And so when these animals are feeding during the summertime months, it's definitely clear that they pinpoint these dense aggregations of krill in order to put on the pounds that they need for long distance migrations and so on. But here's the catch. Krill also have well-known escape responses. And so animals will have to exhibit very efficient foraging strategies in order to minimize that response and then maximize the amount of krill that can go into the pouch. And so here's some critter cam footage that we just published last year. And this is basically a lunge that happens a little bit closer to the surface relative to what I showed you before. So you'll see in this video here, you'll see a krill patch here, and it's starting to rotate. And so you can see how this animal is lunging from below. And so I think of this as an ambush strategy, whereby these animals are minimizing the escape response because they're lunging from below. So if you're krill looking down, there's no backlit, there's no sunlight basically behind the whale coming up. So it'll be basically black on black. Versus if a whale was coming down at krill, you could actually see the downwelling sunlight silhouetted around the krill. So I think this is a way that these animals are increasing their foraging capacity. So what's really exciting now is that everything I've told you so far has been in one dimension, and now our tags are getting much more sophisticated. We can look at animal behavior in 3 dimensions. And so this is a foraging dive, similar to what I showed you before, but sped up 50 times. And you can see how the maneuverability is a very big characteristic of these animal foraging dives. This is a blue whale. So here's another one, only at 10 times speed. This is much closer to the sea surface. We're starting to see some very interesting behaviors. And what you saw right there was actually a 360-degree barrel roll. And you'll see another one right here. This is where the roll starts. One inverted and then flips all the way over. So once we saw that, we actually went back to that video and we saw evidence for what we saw, basically a confirmation of what we saw in the tag data. And you can actually see that krill patch rotating in view. And when we matched it up with the kinematic data, you could actually see the animal rolling 180 degrees. The animal was basically inverted 180 degrees when it started to open its mouth. And then it continued that roll all the way and became horizontal again. So pretty extraordinary behavior, and we think it's a way to maximize, again, the amount of krill that can go into the pouch without being detected visually by krill. So pretty extraordinary behaviors, and we're just now starting to see these types of behaviors because the tags are allowing us to do so. And so now we're getting much more dedicated efforts to measure prey. And we still can't measure prey on the temporal and spatial scale that these whales are exhibiting until we get an echo sounder that we can actually mount on the whale. We're not going to get that. But we can start to see some very interesting patterns. One pattern that is starting to emerge is that when there are very high density krill patches, these animals tend to exhibit straight lunges with very little maneuvering. And so here's an example. Here was a straight lunge. So it's basically just plowing through this pancake layer of krill. Whereas in low density situations, we see, I didn't write that right, there's actually, it's not straight lunges, but they have the inverted lunge and also the 360 lunge, and much more maneuvering. So in this situation, you can see a small patch of krill. This lunge right here was a 360, just like I showed you in that video. This one right here is a 180-degree inverted lunge. So you can see how these foraging strategies are dependent on the ecological context. And so because these animals are air breathers, they have to hold their breath while they're doing this, which is pretty amazing to think about. They're holding their breath, they're accelerating to high speed, they're filtering the engulfed mass, all while holding their breath. So oxygen is a real important currency for these animals. So oxygen and krill density are two currencies that they must balance. So what is more important? Do you value oxygen conservation, or do you value energy gain? And so there are two hypotheses out there. If you value the conservation of oxygen, the theory suggests that you will only exhibit a few lunges per dive. If you want to maximize your energy gain, you will try to do as many lunges as you can. And this is actually what's theoretically possible given how much oxygen you have in your body. And this is all parameterized for a blue whale. And so here's our data for blue whales. And what we have basically foraging behavior under different krill density regimes. So the blue here is when the animals are foraging under very low densities of krill, and the hotter colors here in the bigger circles indicate high densities. What you can see is that at low densities, the blue dots, they tend to be scattered much more around the conservation hypothesis, or what we call optimal foraging. So even though there's krill there, they're only going to do a couple of lunges so that they can get back to the sea surface, replenish oxygen, and be more optimal with respect to oxygen, but they're also missing out on krill. However, when krill density gets very high, they're less concerned about the conservation of oxygen, and they're going to maximize energy gain. And you can see how those points start to follow the maximization of energy. So they'll do as many lunges as possible, even if it means going anaerobic. So if they're above that red line, that means they're going anaerobic. So if there's a huge benefit, that's certainly a cost that's worth exploring for these animals. And if you look at the, basically these are the residuals off of those predictions. If we're above 0 here, we are maximizing oxygen. If you're below 0, you're maximizing energy. You can see as a function of krill density, low densities are all about maximizing oxygen. High densities are all about maximizing energy. So it sort of begs the question, when these animals are feeding deep in the ocean at very, very dense krill patches, how do they know it's there? Because the deep, dark ocean is seems like a very hard place to find krill. Just to give you an idea, here's critter cam footage from very deep in the ocean. It's basically black. So like, how are these animals finding krill? So we found what we think is one clue for one way that they might find krill. And we looked in the chin of these rorquals. Remember I said that they have an unfused mandibular symphysis, or unfused chin. And it's kind of this epicenter of a lot of these adaptations of the engulfment apparatus. So the jaws connect there, the pouch is connected there. There's actually this Y-shaped fibrocartilage skeleton that emerges out of that chin and goes into the pouch. It looks somewhat like a tendon. And so we were really curious as to what's going on there. And there's actually these vibrissae, these are specialized sensory hairs, basically on the tip of the chin there. So we were interested what is actually inside the chin, because it's never been described. And so we were able to get some of these chins CT scanned. So you're just basically looking at density profiles within the chin. And you can see this low density region in here, in between these, the tips of the two mandibles. And so, to make a long story very short, we found a sensory organ in the chin. So, to give you an idea of the spatial resolution of this, it's basically if you were to have mitts and if you were holding a snowball. It's basically the size of this sensory organ in the chin. What's really bizarre about this chin is that it's innervated by the ancestral tooth socket. So baleen whales, as a fetus, these animals have tooth buds, they're resorbed, then they grow baleen. So what's really bizarre is that right out of the ancestral tooth socket, there's a neurovascular bundle that goes into the sensory organ. And this is an MRI. You can see the evidence here for that innervation. And it's also asymmetric. In some animals, it comes from the right jaw. In some animals, it comes from the left. Totally bizarre organ. It's also innervated by these sensory hairs on the chin. Of course, these vibrissae are well known in pinnipeds to allow these animals to find objects while they're blindfolded and also can't hear. So we, yeah, very cool adaptations. So we published this anatomical information, and our best guess of how this actually functions is like this. Lunge initiation, where they're sensing prey actually hitting the chin. When they open their mouth, they can modulate the jaw movements, because when those jaws move, it actually pinches the chin, and so it acts as sort of a hydrostat that's being pinched, so the pressure could increase. We found basically pressure sensors inside the chin. We call them mechanoreceptors at the histological level. And also signaling the end of the lunge. So remember that big tendon that comes out of the chin and goes into the pouch? So we think that once the pouch becomes fully expanded, those forces can then be transmitted to the chin and basically signal it's time to close the mouth. That way you can maximize it in such a way that you have a coordinated lunge instead of something that's kind of sloppy. And so this is our best guess of what is actually happening with an organ that is in no other family of whales. It's not in bowheads, it's not right whales, it's not in gray whales. It's only in the lunge feeders. So we think it's very specific to lunge feeding. So that's one way that animals might find food in a dark ocean. Here's a video from my colleague, Stanford, who attached D-tags to humpback whales feeding at night. And so it's unclear if baleen whales use echolocation like toothed whales do, but I think something like this is definitely suggestive of that. So pretty extraordinary acoustic behavior. So the acoustics are well described for that, but the kinematics at the same time are not. And so I'm working with Allison right now to actually analyze the kinematics to see if we can find some differences between animals that are feeding in the daytime versus at night. And from a much higher frequency to a lower frequency, we're also starting to pick up sounds from these tags that are associated with feeding. And so they're always the low frequency sounds of the big baleen whales tend to be at very shallow depths, but they are associated with feeding. And so just to give you an idea of what these sounds are like. So it's an A call, it's a pulsed call. So most of the energy of these sounds are infrasonic, so we can't hear them, we can only feel them. So we're actually hearing the harmonics right now. With a better subwoofer, you can literally feel that, which is pretty awesome. So A calls, B calls. What you just heard right there, what I think is air recirculation at depth. And so, turn that off. These animals call for long periods of time, but there's only so much air in the lung. And so what we think we heard there was the animal actually pushing air back into its lungs so it can maintain that call. So extraordinary acoustic behaviors that we know little about that are associated with foraging. So it's something that my lab is going to work on much more in the future. So regardless of how they find krill, it's very poorly understood, but they do find them. we think that because of this filter feeding mechanism, very high energetic efficiency, it allows them to maintain extreme body sizes and to have high rates of lipid deposition so that they have large home ranges, they can migrate long distances. This feeding mechanism seems to be fundamental for their life history. So it's very neat, and as these tags become much better, and soon we'll be able to relay some of the kinematic data via satellite, so we'll actually be able to look at some of these feeding behaviors over much greater temporal and spatial scale. So it's going to be a very exciting future for studying bulk filter feeding in these very large whales. So I want to return to drag for a minute because something very interesting came out of it. When we looked at drag coefficient, so drag coefficient is just a metric for how well streamlined a shape is. Something like a Porsche would have a drag coefficient of 0.2, and a parachute would be way up this scale. And so what we did is we measured estimated drag coefficient during the course of a lunge, and we compared it. What was interesting is that it increased by over an order of magnitude, which is pretty extraordinary for a drag coefficient. But we compared it to a parachute, very similar in terms of magnitude of drag coefficient. This makes sense because the purpose of lunge feeding is to create drag in order to expand the pouch. The purpose of a parachute is to create drag so that you can slow down. So this made for the most unlikely collaboration with the world's expert in parachute physics, Jean Potvin. Now I've been working with him for over 5 years now. It's been great. And it was kind of this perfect marriage of research programs because John has been attaching tags and putting them on parachutes and analyzing how those parachutes inflate and looking at the drag forces of how they decelerate. So when I told him about lunge feeding whales and the drag that was involved, he got really excited. And so just to give you a snapshot of what we do, the first question that we asked was, is a lunge feeding whale like an inflating parachute? Can we take Jean's models of how those parachutes inflate and actually learn more about how whales are feeding? And so, again, this is the speed data, what we measure on the tag. And here's when the mouth opens, and this is that deceleration phase of that lunge. And so the first question we asked is it like a parachute in that it's passive? So when a parachute inflates, the only thing slowing down that inflation are the material properties of the parachute. So we basically ran Jean's model, and we got a very poor fit for this passive inflation. So the only thing slowing down the inflation was basically the material properties of the blubber. And so we sort of had to regroup and think more about what's going on. And we forgot about these huge muscle bundles that lie right underneath the ventral pouch here. And I'm talking huge, like in a fin whale, it's about yay thick. Like huge slabs of muscle, really interesting structure. This is muscle too. They look like bungee cords. You can actually pick them up, and they're very extensible. So we thought, okay, maybe these muscles are really important in slowing down the inflation of the pouch. And sure enough, when we put that into the model, we got a very good fit with our kinematic data that we had on the digital tags. So it looks like these animals are using the muscle to slow down the inflation. And because of that, they're actually pushing water forward. So that seems kind of counterintuitive. Why would you push water forward if you're trying to engulf it inside your mouth? But it turns out you can actually decrease your drag that way, and you have lower peak drag forces. And Jean actually told me it may actually help design safer parachutes, because one of the problems with parachutes is that they expand much too quickly, and you have huge forces when the parachute snaps when it reaches its full potential. So understanding, I never thought that doing research on whales would have anything to do with parachutes, but that's kind of the fun thing about collaborating with people from very different backgrounds. So in light of that, and because these animals are pushing water forward, we call that active inflation. It actually creates more drag than typical drag of water just being pushed around you. So I wanted to know about more about the dimensions of the pouch. And so because the whaling industry has these long lists of morphological data, I went back into the Discovery reports and basically did an allometric analysis of the size of the pouch, essentially. So basically, what happens in the very big whales is that when they get bigger, the relative size of the pouch gets much bigger. It's because the skull's getting bigger, length of the pouch is getting bigger, skull width is getting bigger. At the same time, the size of the tail is getting shorter. So the very big adults have huge heads and short stubby tails. So it looks like these animals are investing growth in the skull and also the pouch. It's increasing engulfment capacity. You can see how that changes for a small whale, a medium-sized whale, and a large whale. These animals are engulfing 133% of their weight or volume, and whereas the smaller subadult is only engulfing 75%. So you can see how that allometry has a real effect on the engulfment capacity and presumably the energetic efficiency of foraging. And here's just a look at the scaling of these extraordinary jaw bones that underlie this allometric pattern. You can see me to scale here and here. This is a fossil rorqual almost 5 to 7 million years ago. That was an adult, by the way. And here are Antarctic blue whale mandibles. So you can see how this range in size is pretty extraordinary. And of course, this adult, really small guy, even smaller than today's minkies, it's an indication that these animals were much smaller than they are today. This was a full-on lunge feeding animal based on the anatomy of the jaw, to the best of our knowledge. And so here's just a kind of a brief overview of engulfment capacity as a function of size for the different major rorqual species. And you can see that allometric pattern there. This is much more telling. This is just basically the engulf mass relative to body mass. A factor of 1 means they're engulfing a volume of water that's equal to their body size. So if it's greater than that, it's much higher. So you can see how a lot of the larger rorquals have an adaptation for increased engulfment capacity. And just to give you an idea, 5 minke whale jaws can fit inside that one blue whale jaw. So pretty extraordinary size range just within one family of whales. So that sort of begs the question of how this evolved. What's great about whales is that the fossil record is relatively good. And just looking at the evolution of basically total length as a metric for size over evolutionary time, basically whale ancestors, baleen evolves, you get a little bit of a difference in body size. When lunge feeding evolves, you get this huge gigantism evolving only 3 to 5 million years ago. So whether it's something in the ocean or whether it's an adaptation for lunge feeding that allowed for a gigantism is something that we're working on right now. Working on this with Nick Pyenson at the Smithsonian. So actually looking at these fossils, in addition to the extant species, in a phylogenetic context, to actually look at the evolution of body size in relation to these different adaptations. And what we're seeing, what it looks like is that there's repeated independent evolution of gigantism, even within this one family. Remember, we had evolution of gigantism in whale sharks, and basking sharks, teleos fish, and so on. So this definitely seems to be a repeated pattern in the evolutionary history of aquatic vertebrates. And so returning to the energetics, because they're taking in larger volumes of water, these larger whales are expending disproportionate amounts of energy in order to lunge feed. And that can have real consequences for animals that are diving. Of course, I talked about oxygen conservation as a real currency for these animals. And so you see an increase in cost for the larger animals. And that has a real consequence in that larger animals are executing smaller number of lunges per dive. So blue whales are only executing on average about 4 lunges per dive, whereas a humpback, which is much smaller, can do well over 10 lunges per dive. And so this is where we start to speculate about very fun questions that we have very little data on, but it's very fun to think about why we don't see anything bigger than a blue whale. And so looking at this allometry of energetic cost as a function of body mass, you can see how these energy costs for feeding are starting to increase. And because lunge frequency, the number of lunges per dive, is starting to slow down, you can see how this would theoretically include some kind of limit where these two basically intersect. And so there's some evidence in other filter feeding animals that increasing suspension feeding costs can actually limit indeterminate growth. And for all we know, the very big whales do exhibit indeterminate growth. And so if prey resources are not limiting, and if the scaling of energetics is actually a real process that we're seeing, that may impose an upper limit on body size. It's sort of fun to think about. It's not something that we can actually test. We can build hypothetical rorquals in a virtual computer and do lunge feeding that way, but it's something fun to think about of why we don't see anything bigger than a blue whale. And I think it might be related to how these animals are feeding. And it's kind of ironic that the bulk filter feeding method that enabled these animals to get so big actually is limiting how big they can actually be. And that's hopefully a hypothesis that we might be able to test in future efforts. So how's my time? Just want to leave you with one fun little animation. The tags are getting small enough now that we can look at some of the smaller odontocetes. It's important to study the small odontocetes because it's the comparative taxa for big baleen whales, and they're particulate feeders. And of course, they're well known for exhibiting echolocation behaviors as they're feeding. And so this is our first results for Arizo's dolphin. And so diving to depth, these guys feed at much deeper depths than baleen whales. What's really wild is all these rotations that they're doing as they descend. When they reach prey field, so there's a prey capture event, animals upside down that entire time. There's another prey capture event, still upside down, some loop-de-loops, and then on the ascent, it's just sort of like rotated, like what's that animal doing? I have no idea. So it's kind of fun to have this. It's sort of phenomenological in that we get all this data and we sort of are behind with our hypotheses for how we test. But it's an exciting future because it's a form of natural history that we can also tap into when we do have hypotheses that we can test. So pretty excited to see where this field will go in the future. Thanks a lot for having me, and I'd love to answer any of your questions.
I'm a fluid dynamicist, okay, so I'm very interested in your gulping mechanism.
Right.
So when the mouth first opens, it will be a low drag, and then the whole cavity fill up with water, and then boom, it's high. Now what's the next step? I mean, now it closes jaw, squeezes the water through the baleen, catches the krill. Where does that exhaust water go? Is it like a jet engine that's just landed, they put it in reverse, or what?
That's a great question.
Because if it shot out the front, it would actually be a great drag, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we think it comes out the sides, and then of course we don't have any data. This is what I've just seen from some videos and it's pure speculation. There must be some elastic recoil so the energy can be recaptured because there are those tendinous structures in the pouch. They're using muscle to kind of depress that. And so what's interesting is baleen is so poorly understood. It's this iconic structure. You see it in almost every museum, but we don't know how it works from a hydrodynamic perspective. A lot of people think it works as a dead-end filter, like a coffee filter, but it's not clear how that could work on such a scale because things would get clogged into it. It would be very inefficient. That's why I mentioned cross-flow filtration, where in cross-flow filtration, it's very different than dead-end filtration. So dead-end filtering is like this, where the flow is perpendicular to the filter, but in cross-flow, it goes like this. So you don't get things clogged in the filter itself, so it's very efficient. And again, that's what a lot of beer and wine industries use to have very efficient filtration. That's what I think might be going on here. And I think it would be a really cool grad student project to actually get a rack of baleen, put it in a flume, and try and do some quantitative studies of looking at flow. And you could actually experimentally manipulate that. You could take the fringes off to see what the effective fringes are. You could vary the gap in between the different plates. So it's a very interesting structure, and it might actually have something to offer for filtration on an industrial scale because it does happen on that scale. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Pair of questions. You mentioned that they slow down as they hit the patch of krill, and you said that might have something to do with the drag.
Yeah.
Is it possible that it also has something to do with creating a bow wave that might push away the krill themselves if they kept the high speed or higher speed?
Right, that's great. Well, all of our hydrodynamic models suggest that they purposely push the water forward. We call it active inflation. And so remember I talked about this bungee-like muscles in the pouch.
It seems contradictory to that.
It does, yeah. And so why would you push something forward if you're trying to get it inside the mouth? So there is a bow wave, but if you generate that bow wave slowly over time, they can close the mouth before that bow wave gets in front of them. Because that pouch goes all the way down to the belly button. That's half the length of the animal. So once water gets to the belly button, it's almost time to close the mouth. Right. And it's slowly accelerating the fluid over time. And you can actually see this in videos if you have a close look. You can see the water just starting to come out as they close the mouth. So it looks like there is a bow wave inside the animal as it's being accelerated forward, but it's highly coordinated in such a way where they can close it right before the water starts to get pushed out of the mouth.
So just a quick question about allometry,
Uh-huh.
which as you gave this wonderful talk, you led everybody to know that there had to be allometry.
Yeah.
And sure enough, there is. Is there also some sort of allometry of the cross-sectional area intersected by the plane of the mandibles relative to the volume of the pouch? Is that changing with body
The
size?
cross-section of the actual jaw.
Yeah, well, not the jaw, but the sort of, I guess, semicircular or triangular area. You
Oh, yes,
mentioned,
yes.
mentioned the whole pouch. But
Oh,
you didn't-
absolutely, yeah, the area of the mouth itself is also positively allometric. So
Is that relative to the whole volume, or?
it's it's relative to the length of the animal.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if that is accelerating or just keeping pace with the volume, which is what you,
Right.
the data you displayed.
Right, that I don't know. Well, it depends on I guess I don't understand your question fully.
Well, as you're getting bigger, you might want to increase that area, because that's, after all, as the water's rushing in.
Absolutely.
Fill it in.
Well, yeah, increasing area
that might have-
will increase the flux of water into the mouth,
Right,
of course.
right.
And that's the
So it'd be nice to
primary
know that.
function, I assume.
Right, it'd be
Yeah.
nice to know that relative to the volume.
Relative to the volume, I don't know, let's look at it. Yeah, that would be very cool.
I have two questions. I wasn't clear about what you said about echolocation in the lunge feeding baleen whales, although that humpback sounded like it was echolocated.
Absolutely, yeah, that paper came out in 2007, and a lot of people didn't get as excited as I did. The thing is, we've tagged so many animals and we've never found that again, so it's sort of been, we think it might be just a specific case for a specific population of humpbacks, which of course exhibit a wide variety of behaviors, unlike most of the other rorquals. I don't know, it certainly sounds like echolocation to me. Some people, the acoustics people call it echo ranging. They get very snooty about that thing, but it definitely, to me, it looks like echolocation. The animal's feeding at night, and right now I'm looking at the kinematics to compare it to humpbacks that are feeding during the day. So it'll be interesting to look more into that behavior. The thing is, we haven't been able to replicate that.
Another
So
question I had was, there are these filter feeding giant mammals and filter feeding giant sharks. There's even filter feeding seabirds.
Mhm.
Why don't there seem to be any filter feeding giant bony fish?
There were back before the KT boundary. There was a 100 million year dynasty of giant teleost ram feeding fishes. There was a paper in Science back in 2010 that sort of described that. With several species, probably a huge predator deal with giant teleost fish. So I don't know why they aren't around now. Maybe the niche has been taken up by whales and they haven't been able to reinvade. I'm not sure. It's a great question. Now we have a lot of elasmobranchs that are ram feeders that are also giants. So it's a great question. Yeah.
I had a question to compare this kind of filter feeding with filter feeding flagellated protozoa and invertebrates up to, say, sponges, where there seems to be a fairly constant water volume cleared per body volume. It's around 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 5th. But it's all at very low Reynolds number on small particles. If you made a similar calculation
Yeah.
with this, it's probably 2 or 3 orders of magnitude lower.
Right. Well, so that's a fantastic point. Something I didn't go into. Actually, I got a slide. So we have calculated Reynolds number for the flow inside the pouch while it's going across the baleen fringes, and so that's the actual operational limit. Let me just find it here. That's the operational. Sorry, let me just find it here. Okay. So we've calculated Reynolds number for the fringes, so that's where filtration occurs. And so even though these are huge animals, if you calculate the Reynolds number, it's very close to what we see in fishes. So that's an intermediate Reynolds number. So people that aren't familiar with Reynolds number, it's a metric that we use to describe the character of the physics of flow. And if you can match Reynolds number, how flow occurs is similar across systems. So it's pretty amazing to match Reynolds number with filter feeding fishes and with whales. And because you can put a camera inside a fish's mouth, you can actually see that cross-flow filtration is occurring. You can't do that yet with whales, but given the similarity in Reynolds number, it looks like that might be the case. That's a great question. Yep.
How do you think something like a supplementer to the feeding behavior, the lunge feeding behavior, like a bubble net, would alter your numbers that you've calculated for the metrics? For the humpback whale, it was a lot higher.
Right.
So they use bubble nets. So do you think that increases the efficiency or maybe adds more of an energetic cost to not calculate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So humpbacks, when they're feeding on fish, it's like a totally different world. So most of what I showed you was on krill. And we focused on krill because krill seems to be a common prey type among the different species. So it gets really interesting when they start to feed on different prey types. So when do they switch and what are the energetic costs? We're just starting to model the energetic costs when they're feeding on fish, different body attitudes and different behaviors. But no, I was just talking to Joe about this earlier today. So that's a totally unexplored area. So I actually don't know the answer. But I do know that they lunge at higher speeds. So that would create greater drag, which would increase the energetic cost. But also, if you can actually capture a high proportion of fish, that would be a good benefit. So kind of the cost-benefit analysis would still be...
Do they open their mouth this far?
From what I see, when they're coming out of the water, it looks like they're at 90-degree gape, which would suggest that they're doing the same kind of full gape lunge. But there is evidence of animals doing smaller gapes. So it looks like they have quite a bit of control over that gape angle cycle. And of course, that will control how much drag is incurred and so on.
How did you get to do the CT scan on such a large animal?
We actually used a logging scanner. So at the University of British Columbia, they have this giant CT scanner, and they scan logs like all day long. So when we showed up with a whale chin, they were so excited. Everyone came, and they said, "Whenever you want to do this again, let us know." So it was a lot of fun. We also did it in the hospital, which was really fun to do the MRI. So it's great when you get people excited to work on your stuff for you. Yeah.
I didn't hear two questions ago, but I don't think it's the same question. My question was about the potential impact of fisheries. So some forage fisheries, not even just for fish, but for krill, they target the dense schools, and you talked about the different foraging strategies between being determined by density. So if you have fisheries that are interrupting the density of certain fish schools or the krill schools, or fish if you're looking at a different whale species, is anybody looking at the costs to the animals or populations with rippling effects of that?
Not that I know of. We published a paper back before 2010 on looking at the effects of fisheries and climate change on blue whale populations, basically when you implement this foraging model into that. It's so model heavy, and we know so little, it's hard to actually determine what the real effects would be. I mean, obviously at some critical threshold of krill, lunge feeding becomes energetically not efficient. And I've made that calculation at about 100 grams per cubic meter. And so that's about 100 individual krill per cubic meter. So it may not be an abundance thing, but if something happens in the ocean, whether it's anthropogenic or climate change or fishing, if something happens where that density becomes low, then especially the big filter feeding animals, will have a real problem. That's not my expertise, but that's my best guess. What's interesting is that when we have tags on blue whales, for example, they're lunge feeding at depth all day long, and when the krill starts to migrate up towards the sea surface, they're tracking that krill, and they still are lunging all the way until just about dusk, and then all of a sudden the whales stop feeding. And we don't know why, but it might be because the krill are dispersing, and so the density is so low that these animals are not feeding anymore. So it really kind of emphasizes how important krill density is to especially blue whales, which only feed on krill.
Quick comment, cross-flow filtration is used by chemical oceanographers to separate organic matter of different sizes too.
Right.
A question, you didn't address the energetics related to temperature at all. I wonder about a blue whale diving in the Antarctic.
Right.
Whether with being exposed to much lower temperatures, how the energetics would work out.
I think one of my colleagues has this idea that whales love the ice age. I think because of the thermal inertia and because countercurrent heat exchangers, I think there's no problem these guys maintaining temperature. Even in the tongue, even in the structures inside the mouth, everything seems to be well insulated and kind of thermally stable.
What's the total time of the dive?
Total time for a typical blue whale dive could be 10 minutes to 200 meters. The filtration cycle is about 50 seconds, so that's when they would have cold water inside the pouch. But there's, I think it was published in Science back in the day with gray whale countercurrent heat exchangers in the tongue. So it seems like they are well equipped to handle that kind of temperature.
Maybe time for one more question. There's one more question. Okay, well, Jeremy's going to be in the Okuba room for the next little while if you want to talk to him further. So thanks to Jeremy for coming all the way from